I still remember the quiet weight of certain evenings from my childhood, the ones when the house seemed to breathe alongside me and every sound felt like it carried a secret. I grew up in a small, cluttered home where my mother saved old scarves and worn sweaters in boxes she swore she'd sort through someday. I never told her how often I'd lift a corner of those boxes just to brush my fingers across the fabrics. I didn't know what I was searching for back then, only that something stirred in me when I felt those soft threads, as if a part of me that had no words yet was gently waking up. I kept those moments tucked away like tiny stolen treasures, never fully understanding why they mattered so much. Years passed with that same quiet wondering inside me, hidden under school days, family routines, and the steady march of time. Even as I grew older, even as I learned to act like someone who didn't carry secret questions, I felt the same gentle pull whenever I came across a forgotten scarf or an old cardigan left draped over a chair. I can still picture myself standing in the hallway mirror one rainy afternoon, draping one of my mother's shawls over my shoulders and immediately feeling both frightened and comforted. I pulled it off the moment I heard footsteps, the fear so strong it made my hands shake. Looking back, I realize how hard I tried to bury parts of myself simply because I didn't know how the world, my world, would receive them. It wasn't until much later, after years of pretending not to feel what I felt, that the night came when everything shifted. The house was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that makes you listen to your own breath. I had found an old box tucked behind a stack of photo albums, filled with things my mother no longer wore but never threw away. Something in me decided that if I didn't try, just once, I might never understand why this longing had followed me for so many years. My hands trembled as I lifted a faded blouse and a soft skirt, and for a moment I hesitated, hearing echoes of every fear I'd carried since childhood. But something else whispered louder, the simple, aching desire to know myself. When I finally slipped into those clothes, there was no dramatic moment, no sudden revelation, just a wave of quiet recognition. It wasn't about looking different or becoming someone new. It felt more like coming home to a part of myself I had been too afraid to acknowledge. Standing in front of the mirror, I whispered the name that had lived in the back of my mind for as long as I could remember. Stephanie. I didn't say it loudly. I didn't need to. The name felt soft and familiar, like a hand I'd been waiting to hold. Yet even in that moment of calm, fear wrapped itself around me. What if someone found out? What if this fragile truth shattered before I could even understand it? I spent that night moving carefully through the shadows of my own room, listening to the soft rustle of the fabric as I walked, feeling the strange mixture of relief and worry twisting inside me. I thought about my family and the memories woven into every corner of the house. I wondered what they would say if they knew, and the thought alone made my heart ache. But there was something else too, something unexpectedly powerful, a sense of gentleness toward myself that I had never felt before. It was as if each step I took in that borrowed outfit slowly loosened the knot that had lived in my chest for decades. I realized then how much of my life had been shaped by fear, and how deeply I longed for the courage to live with a different kind of honesty. Toward morning, as the first hints of light touched the window, I changed back into the clothes the world expected me to wear. I folded everything neatly and returned it to the box, but my hands lingered on the lid before closing it. Even though the night had ended, something inside me had shifted, something too real to bury again. I sat on the edge of my bed, thinking about all the years I had spent hiding from myself, and how many people, quiet, ordinary people, carry secret pieces of their identity the same way. It made me wonder how many lives would be lighter if we spoke to ourselves with more kindness, if we listened to the small truths that whisper inside us long before we dare to speak them aloud. And that was the night I first secretly became Stephanie, in the quiet safety of a home I both loved and feared disappointing. I didn't know what the future would hold or how long it would take for me to live fully in that truth. But I knew, in a way I couldn't ignore anymore, that my journey had begun. Every step since then has been a mixture of courage and hesitation, of learning to forgive myself for the years I spent in hiding and learning to trust the voice that finally found its name. And sometimes when I think back on that night, I hope that anyone listening, anyone carrying their own unspoken truth, finds a moment of stillness long enough to hear what their heart has been trying to say all along. The days after that first night carried a strange, gentle weight. I went about my routines just as I always had. Morning coffee, the quiet drive to work, the familiar small talk with neighbors, but something inside me had shifted in a way I didn't yet know how to understand. It felt as though a long-lost companion had begun walking beside me, silent but present, reminding me of who I was when no one else was looking. I found myself thinking back to my childhood again, to all the little moments I had ignored or dismissed, and realizing how many signs had been there all along. I remembered afternoons spent lingering by my mother's dresser, the soft glow of the lamp catching on her jewelry, and how I'd feel a kind of wistful ache without knowing why. Those memories rose up now with new meaning, as if they had been patiently waiting for me to catch up. But with each memory came fear as well, the old familiar kind that tightened around my ribs when I least expected it. I worried that even acknowledging these feelings privately somehow made me fragile in a world that valued certainty. There were moments when I'd catch my reflection in a window and feel suddenly exposed, as though people could somehow see through the layers I'd built to protect myself. I started avoiding certain conversations, afraid someone might accidentally brush too close to the truth I was trying to steady myself around. Yet underneath all that fear was a quiet spark. Hope, I think, that maybe one day this truth wouldn't have to be hidden so carefully. One evening not long after, I found myself back in the storage room where the old boxes sat gathering dust. I told myself I was only looking for a photo album, something I needed as an excuse, but my hands reached instinctively for the box that held the clothes from that night. I didn't dress up then. I simply sat on the floor with the box open in front of me, touching the fabrics like they were old letters from a friend I hadn't seen in years. I thought about how strange it was that something so simple, cloth, thread, color, could hold so much meaning. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the hallway clock, and in that silence, I began to wonder what kind of life I might have lived if I'd had the courage to listen to myself sooner. The thought wasn't painful exactly, but it carried a kind of tenderness that made me sit there longer than I intended. As weeks passed, I began taking small, almost invisible steps toward understanding myself more fully. Sometimes it was as simple as letting myself imagine what life would feel like if I didn't have to hide. Other times it came through moments of reflection, on my drive home from work, or while folding laundry, or when I caught the sunset from the kitchen window. I found myself practicing the name Stephanie in my mind, not whispering it aloud this time but letting it echo quietly within me. It felt like trying on a new part of my soul, one that had always been there but had never been given permission to grow. There was fear in those thoughts, yes, but there was also a sense of calm determination, like I was tracing a path that had been waiting for me. Of course, not every step forward felt steady. Some nights I lay awake, wondering if I was being foolish, if I was too old to be exploring pieces of myself I had ignored for decades. I worried about my family, about how they might react, about the possibility of disappointing people I loved. I imagined conversations that might never happen, bracing myself for reactions that existed only in my imagination. But even in those anxious moments, the truth didn't shrink or fade. If anything, it grew more patient, more certain, reminding me gently that the heart doesn't follow schedules or rules. It follows honesty, even when honesty arrives late in life. And the older I became, the more I realized how rare it is to find something that feels undeniably true. It was during one quiet Sunday morning that another shift began. I had been sorting through old letters and photographs, trying to organize things the way I'd been promising myself I would for years. Among the piles, I found a picture of myself as a child, standing in the living room, wearing one of my mother's scarves draped around my shoulders, laughing in a way that was completely unguarded. I stared at that photo for a long time, tracing the edges of the scarf and the expression on my young face. There was something unmistakably genuine in that moment of the past, something I had spent too long trying to bury. Holding that photograph, I felt a wave of emotions: grief, nostalgia, courage, and something like forgiveness. It was as if the child I once was had finally turned around to look at me, asking softly why it had taken me so long to remember who I was. And so part 2 of this journey wasn't marked by a single moment or revelation. It unfolded slowly, in memories and reflections, in tiny acts of courage and quiet evenings spent listening to the truths I had silenced for far too long. I didn't announce anything to anyone yet. I didn't change my life in large ways. But inside me, something was beginning to settle, to take root. I was learning day by day that becoming myself wasn't a matter of sudden transformation. It was a long, tender process of coming back to someone I had always been. And as I held that photograph of my younger self, I felt a strange and comforting sense that the journey ahead, however uncertain, was finally beginning to make sense. The weeks that followed carried a quiet rhythm all their own. I started keeping a small journal tucked in the back of my drawer, the pages mostly empty except for the occasional reflection or memory I dared to write down. At first, I hesitated to even put pen to paper, worried that naming these thoughts somehow made them too real. But slowly, the act of writing became a form of release, a way to talk to myself honestly when no one else could. I wrote about the scarves and blouses, about afternoons spent daydreaming in front of mirrors, about the strange comfort I felt in pretending, if only in private, that another version of me existed. Each line felt like a tiny lifeline, a way to hold myself steady when the world demanded conformity. One rainy evening, I found myself lingering in the living room long after my family had gone to bed. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch just enough to feel like companions, and I allowed myself to imagine what life might be like if I embraced Stephanie more fully. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, a feeling I hadn't been able to put into words for decades. I remember staring at the faded wallpaper, thinking about all the choices I had made in my life to keep up appearances, to avoid conflict, to avoid fear, and realizing how much energy it had taken to keep those layers in place. That night, I felt the smallest flicker of rebellion, not against my family, not against the life I had built, but against the quiet voice that had long told me I wasn't allowed to exist fully as myself. Over time, I began to notice the little ways this truth seeped into daily life. Sometimes it was as simple as letting my hand brush over a scarf in a shop window, or lingering longer in front of the mirror to adjust a collar just so, or pausing on a Sunday morning to think about how Stephanie would sit in the quiet kitchen, imagining a life without fear. These small gestures weren't about being seen, they were about feeling seen by myself. It was during these moments that I discovered something surprising. The fear I had carried all my life wasn't a wall, it was a lens. And through that lens, every ordinary act, folding laundry, reading the newspaper, brewing tea, began to feel heavier, yes, but also more meaningful. Yet, despite the comfort of these private rituals, anxiety remained a constant companion. There were nights when I would wake up in a cold sweat, imagining the world knowing before I was ready, imagining the disapproval, the confusion, the loss. I thought about my parents, about the quiet kindnesses they had shown me over the years, and wondered if this part of me might fracture that bond. I wrestled with the fear of misunderstanding, the fear of being judged, and the fear that I might never feel fully safe expressing myself outside the walls of my room. And yet, there was another feeling beneath it all, a stubborn insistence that I could not keep hiding forever. Stephanie existed, and she deserved at least the quiet dignity of acknowledgement, even if only to myself. One late afternoon, I decided to take a small step that felt monumental in its own way. I chose a familiar outfit from the box, one that I had never dared wear beyond the privacy of my room, and I sat quietly in the living room while the sunlight spilled through the window. I didn't leave the room, I didn't seek attention. I only let myself exist like this, letting the warmth of the sun mingle with the warmth I was finally allowing inside me. I closed my eyes and breathed slowly, thinking about the little child I had once been, imagining her watching me with wide eyes full of hope. And in that moment, I realized something. The fear of being discovered didn't have to dictate the way I felt about myself. I could be Stephanie quietly, softly, lovingly, even if the world wasn't ready yet. That night, as I put the clothes back and returned to my ordinary routines, I felt something new settle in my chest. It wasn't joy exactly, nor was it relief. It was a kind of steady calm, a recognition that my journey wasn't about dramatic revelations or external validation. It was about building trust with myself, piece by piece, in the quiet hours of the day and the soft shadows of the evening. I understood then that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it is as small as acknowledging a truth to yourself over and over again, until that truth begins to feel like home. And as I lay in bed that night, the memories of childhood scarves, stolen glances in mirrors, and whispered names all weaving together, I knew I had crossed another quiet threshold. Stephanie existed now, not as a fantasy, not as a secret dream, but as a real, living, breathing part of who I was. The journey was far from over. I knew there would be moments of doubt, days when fear would creep back in and whisper that it was safer to retreat, to blend, to pretend. But I also knew something stronger now, something older and quieter. The person I had been hiding from myself for so long had always been there, waiting patiently, and it was time to meet her with kindness and respect. I understood that acceptance, first of all from myself, was the beginning of everything else. And as I closed my eyes that night, I whispered once more, quietly, almost reverently, the name that had carried me this far, Stephanie. I felt the echo of it linger in the room, a soft, enduring promise that this journey, with all its fears, joys, and small victories, was only beginning to unfold. The following months were gentle and tentative, like the first brush of spring after a long winter. I continued my private rituals with Stephanie, allowing myself small moments of presence, slipping into an old blouse while reading, tying a scarf around my neck and catching my reflection, pausing in front of the mirror a little longer than necessary. But life outside my room pressed in relentlessly, with errands, work, family dinners, and the quiet hum of obligations that never paused for self-discovery. I found that balancing these inner moments with the world beyond my door was more delicate than I imagined. Some days the fear pressed back harder, whispering that I should abandon this part of myself, that it was safer to remain invisible. Yet every time I hesitated, I felt Stephanie waiting patiently, a calm presence that reminded me the journey wasn't about rushing, it was about tending to the self I had ignored for too long. One Saturday, I ventured into the attic, an unexplored part of the house that carried its own dust and shadows. There, among forgotten boxes and old furniture, I discovered a trunk filled with family photographs dating back decades. I lifted the lid slowly, running my fingers over the faded edges, and found pictures of my mother and father as young adults, full of hope and laughter, and pictures of myself as a child, often peeking curiously at the camera while wearing pieces of my mother's clothing. I sat on the cold floor, turning each photograph over in my hands, feeling a strange mix of nostalgia and revelation. How long had I been walking through my life without noticing the threads connecting past to present, parent to child, memory to identity? Each image seemed to whisper encouragement, a quiet reminder that the person I was discovering had roots long before I even knew her name. It was around that time that I began imagining small ways to let Stephanie touch the outside world, cautiously. Not through announcements or confrontations, but through the little choices that made me feel visible in my own way. A scarf tied neatly around my neck on a chilly morning, a sweater carefully draped over my shoulders when visiting the library, or the softest blush on my cheeks when no one was looking. These acts, invisible to most, became declarations of self-love and acceptance, each one reinforcing the quiet understanding that I was allowed to exist as I was. Yet the fear remained, sometimes flaring unexpectedly. A glance in the hallway, an accidental comment from a sibling, a sudden thought that perhaps someone might see through me. In those moments, I reminded myself gently that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to keep moving even when fear is present. One evening, my father asked me to help him with a project in the garage. As we worked side by side, I noticed how ordinary yet intimate these moments could be. I found myself thinking about all the years I had hidden pieces of myself, and how much love had been present all along, even when I felt unworthy or unseen. There was no revelation, no confession, just the slow, steady acknowledgement that life had a way of holding us close, even when we weren't ready to be fully ourselves. I realized that the world outside my private spaces wasn't inherently cruel or unkind. It was simply unknown, and stepping into it required patience, observation, and the courage to trust both myself and others. During these months, I also revisited childhood memories with a renewed clarity. I thought of rainy afternoons spent reading alone by the window, of small triumphs that went unnoticed, of whispered conversations with imaginary friends that had given me solace when the world felt too large. Each memory was a quiet guide, teaching me that identity is rarely formed in a single moment. It is a mosaic of countless small experiences, some joyful, some painful, some secret. Stephanie, I realized, had always been part of that mosaic, patiently waiting for me to recognize her presence. And in embracing those memories, I began to feel a sense of continuity, a recognition that my life was not about hiding, but about gently weaving all the fragments of self into something whole and enduring. By the end of that season, I found a rhythm that felt both grounding and liberating. Stephanie existed quietly in my life, sometimes invisible to everyone but me, sometimes hinted at in small gestures that no one could name but which carried enormous significance for me. I learned to hold both fear and hope in the same hand, understanding that they could coexist without diminishing each other. And as I sat one evening, watching sunlight drift across the kitchen table, I whispered her name softly, feeling it settle like a promise in my chest. Stephanie was no longer a secret to be feared. She was a companion, a teacher, a part of me I had finally learned to welcome. And for the first time, I felt ready to imagine a future in which fear was only one note in a much larger, more beautiful symphony of being. The following months brought both comfort and unease in equal measure. I had grown accustomed to the quiet rituals that allowed Stephanie to exist alongside the rest of my life, but every so often the walls I had built for safety seemed to close in unexpectedly. A simple glance from a neighbor, a passing comment from a colleague, or the hum of the refrigerator at night could suddenly carry the weight of imagined judgment. I realized that this journey was not a straight path but a winding one, full of moments when courage and fear intertwined in ways that felt both heavy and tender. It was in those moments that I began to understand the depth of patience required, not just with the world but with myself, with the parts of me I had long ignored. One rainy evening, I found myself revisiting the trunk of photographs in the attic. I traced my finger over the edges of a picture of my mother as a young woman, her eyes bright with life, and then to one of myself as a child, half hidden behind a curtain, peeking out with quiet curiosity. Something about seeing these images side by side made me reflect on how much of identity is inherited, passed down quietly through gestures, habits, and memories. I began to see Stephanie not as something separate from my past but as a continuation of it, a culmination of curiosity, longing, and quiet courage that had been present in small ways since childhood. It was humbling and yet profoundly comforting to realize that the path I was on was not entirely new. It had been laid long before I even knew her name. There were nights, though, when the weight of secrecy pressed down harder than I expected. I would lie awake imagining conversations I might never have, imagining the questions that could be asked, the confusion that might follow. I thought about my parents, about my siblings, about friends who knew only the surface of who I was. The fear of misunderstanding, of disappointing them, sometimes made me want to retreat, to return to the comfort of invisibility. And yet, in the same moments, I felt Stephanie's presence, a quiet, patient reminder that hiding, though safe, was never truly fulfilling. Courage, I realized, wasn't about bold gestures. It was about choosing, over and over again, to honor the self that had waited so long to be acknowledged. One Sunday afternoon, I allowed myself a small but meaningful act. I wore one of the scarves I had long adored during a walk in the garden behind the house. The sun was gentle, casting a warm glow across the flowers, and for a moment the world seemed to slow. No one was there to see, and yet it felt like a declaration of self-love, a whispered acknowledgement that I was allowed to exist fully, even if privately. I noticed how the air felt different when I permitted myself this small freedom, the way the breeze brushed across my face, the way the garden seemed to welcome me. It was ordinary, yet transformative, a reminder that moments of authenticity need not be grand or visible to be profound. At the same time, I began reflecting more deeply on the idea of family and connection. I thought about my parents, who had shaped me in countless ways without knowing the full extent of my inner life. I thought about my siblings, whose laughter and gentle teasing carried echoes of both love and judgment. And I realized that acceptance, both giving it and receiving it, was not something demanded but cultivated, a quiet practice of empathy and patience. Stephanie, I understood, was teaching me more than self-expression. She was teaching me how to approach the people I loved with honesty, grace, and humility, even if that honesty had to begin in small, cautious steps. By the end of that season, a subtle shift had taken place. Stephanie was no longer only a secret companion in the shadows. She had become a touchstone for reflection, courage, and quiet joy. I still feared discovery, still wrestled with self-doubt, and still carried the heavy weight of imagined judgment, but I had learned to sit with those fears without letting them define me. I understood that identity is rarely a single dramatic moment. It is a tapestry of small truths, tender acknowledgments, and patient self-compassion. And as I closed the trunk of photographs that evening, the soft echo of her name lingered in my mind. Stephanie. I whispered it to myself, and for the first time it felt like a promise rather than a secret. A promise that no matter how slow the journey, she would always have a place in my heart, guiding me gently toward the person I was meant to be. Time, I realized, had a way of teaching patience even when I didn't feel ready. Stephanie had grown quietly inside me, like a soft light I could carry without fear, but the world beyond my walls still felt vast and uncertain. I began noticing subtle shifts in my daily life. The way I held myself a little differently, the way I allowed small gestures of self-recognition to remain unhidden. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was like watching a river slowly carve its path through stone. And each day, as I acknowledged her presence, I felt a strange but comforting sense of continuity, a feeling that my life, messy, ordinary, full of unspoken questions, was slowly coming together in ways I hadn't dared to hope for. One quiet evening, I found myself sitting on the porch, the autumn air crisp and golden, thinking about the long journey that had brought me here. I remembered the scarves and the blouses, the afternoons spent imagining, the nights of fear, the private whispers of my own name. And I realized that the transformation had never been about clothing or appearances at all. It had been about recognition, acceptance, and courage. The courage to sit with myself honestly, the courage to honor the parts of me that had been silenced for decades. Stephanie was no longer a secret. She was a witness, a companion, a voice of gentle affirmation that had always been part of me. There were moments, of course, when fear crept back in. I thought about family gatherings, conversations with old friends, and the subtle judgments that could lurk beneath smiles. But I had learned to hold that fear without letting it control me. I understood now that identity is not defined by the reactions of others but by the quiet truths we nurture inside ourselves. I began imagining ways to let Stephanie exist more openly, not for the sake of spectacle, but as a form of honesty with the world and with myself. It was a slow, careful process, but I realized that even the smallest steps toward authenticity carry immense power. I also found myself reflecting on the meaning of love, both given and received. I thought about my parents, whose kindness and imperfections had shaped me, and about the many unseen moments that had quietly supported who I was becoming. I realized that love is patient, and sometimes it takes time for people to fully understand one another. The same patience applied to myself. I learned to forgive the years I had spent hiding, to embrace the parts of me I had long considered fragile, and to approach life with a gentleness I had rarely practiced before. Stephanie had taught me that acceptance begins at home, within the self, and radiates outward in ways that can touch everyone around us. And so, one evening, I allowed myself a small, brave act. I wore a simple outfit I had long loved, soft, familiar, unassuming, and I sat with a cup of tea in the kitchen, watching the light fade behind the trees. No one was around, yet I felt profoundly present, fully myself. I traced the name Stephanie on the surface of my thoughts, whispered it softly, and let the weight of decades of fear lift just enough to feel the full depth of quiet freedom. It was not a dramatic reveal, nor a sudden epiphany. It was a gentle, enduring acknowledgement. I existed, fully and without apology. I had learned at last that identity is not something to be hidden, but something to be tenderly known and embraced. Looking back now, decades later, I carry those nights, those whispers, and those first tentative steps with me. Stephanie walks with me still, not as a secret, not as a shadow, but as a part of myself I finally know I can honor. And when I think of the journey, the fears, the doubts, the memories, and the quiet victories, I am filled with gratitude for every moment, every hesitation, every whispered truth that led me here. The lesson I hold most dearly is simple, yet profound. Courage is often quiet, identity is tender, and love, above all, the love we give ourselves, can carry us through even the longest, darkest nights. And with that understanding, I whisper her name one last time, softly, as if letting it float into the world itself. Stephanie. She is here. She has always been here. And now so am I.